The long-range arrays at Meridian Station had been recording background noise for 11 years before anyone noticed it wasn't random. That was the quiet truth nobody in the press release mentioned. The discovery of the Varrock signal wasn't a dramatic moment in a control room with flashing lights and shouting scientists. It was a junior analyst named Corporal Yusra Osei who flagged an anomaly during a routine data audit on a Tuesday afternoon, somewhere between her second coffee and a late lunch she never got to eat. She almost didn't submit the report. The signal embedded in the subcarrier frequencies of deep space background radiation was subtle in the way that a surgeon's incision is subtle, precise, minimal, and unmistakably intentional. It took the Joint Analysis Team at the Strategic Astronomy Division 46 days to confirm what Osei had suspected in the first 46 minutes. Someone was listening to us. And had been for a very long time. The decision to classify the discovery at the highest military intelligence tier was made within hours of confirmation. Earth's governments had a protocol for this. It was called Contingency Aurelius, and it had been updated exactly 17 times since its original drafting in 2031. The core philosophy of Aurelius had never changed. First contact is a military event before it is a diplomatic one. Not because humanity was aggressive. Because the universe had no record of being kind to civilizations that assumed otherwise. Commander Dara Vasquez had been the strategic liaison officer for the Aurelius Division for 3 years when the signal was confirmed. She was 41, former Deep Space Patrol, with 2 tours on the Jupiter monitoring belt and a doctorate in xenolinguistics she had pursued on the quiet assumption she'd never actually needed. She was wrong about that assumption in the most significant way a person can be wrong. The briefing she received the morning after confirmation lasted 6 hours. She would later say the most striking part wasn't the signal itself. It was the age of it. The pattern embedded in those subcarrier frequencies, once decoded across 17 layers of recursive mathematical structure, contained references to human radio transmissions. Specific ones. The 1974 Arecibo message. The 1977 Voyager recordings. Even fragments of early 21st century television broadcasts, restructured into mathematical acknowledgement sequences. They had been responding to us for decades. We simply hadn't known how to listen. The question everyone asked, Vasquez would later write in her unpublished memoir, was whether they were friendly. I thought that was the wrong question. The right question was, what do they want us to know about them before they arrive? Because they were arriving. The signal's encoded trajectory data, buried in the third layer of its mathematical structure, was unambiguous. A fleet, by any reasonable interpretation of the density figures, had departed from a system approximately 340 light-years distant. At the velocities implied by the propulsion signature embedded in the signal, arrival in the outer solar system was estimated at somewhere between 14 and 18 months. Earth had 14 months to prepare for the most consequential event in human history. What the public announcement, released 8 months later once basic defensive posture had been established, described as a historic moment of potential interstellar dialogue, was, in the rooms where decisions were made, being called something else entirely. A reckoning. The Varrock fleet, as it was designated by the time imagery came in from the long-range optical arrays at Lunar Station 7, was not small. The preliminary count from the first imaging pass suggested 40 to 60 distinct vessels of varying mass. The largest, which would later be confirmed as the flagship, the vessel that would come to be called the Queen's ship in the media, though its actual Varrock designation translated more accurately as the First Voice, was estimated at approximately 4.2 kilometers in length. To put that in perspective, the largest warship in Earth's combined fleet, the USEF Magellan, was 890 meters. The math of that comparison produced a particular kind of silence in briefing rooms. Not panic. Not despair. Something more disciplined than either. A recalibration of expectations, a quiet shelving of assumptions, and the steady, methodical work of people who understood that the size of a problem is not a measure of its solvability. Humanity had faced asymmetrical challenges before. The response wasn't to match the Varrock fleet in tonnage. Earth didn't have 14 months to build that. The response was something more characteristically human, to understand the problem deeply enough to work around it. That work fell to a small team, operating out of a converted research station on the Martian plateau, whose existence was not formally acknowledged in any public document. Their designation was Study Group 11. Their mandate, in the dry language of the directive that created them, was xenolinguistic and behavioral pattern analysis for strategic application. In plain language, figure out who these people are, how they think, and find any advantage that geography and physics and 40 years of their own transmitted signals might give us. Vasquez ran Study Group 11. She had 12 people, 18 months of archived Varrock transmissions, and a hypothesis that most of her superiors considered overly optimistic. Her hypothesis was this: the Varrock had not come to conquer. They had come to assess. And in that distinction, between a species arriving to take and a species arriving to judge, lay the entire margin of human survival. The signal, she argued in the 80-page brief that nearly ended her career, was not a threat delivery system. It was a test protocol. The Varrock had been watching. They had been measuring. And the encoding of our own transmissions back to us, restructured, refined, mathematically elevated, was not a display of superiority. It was an invitation. They are not asking us to surrender, she wrote. They are asking us whether we are worth speaking to. The brief was rejected twice before it was accepted. By the time the Varrock fleet crossed the heliopause and entered the outer solar system, Vasquez had been given one additional resource she hadn't asked for: a direct communication channel rigged through the Deep Space Relay Network that would allow a single human voice to broadcast on the exact frequency the Varrock had been using to transmit their encoded signals. The frequency was specific to the point of being personal. Analysis had determined it matched, precisely, the carrier wave of the Arecibo message from 1974. They had kept the channel open for 50 years. Vasquez studied the transmission logs every night for 6 weeks before she understood what that meant. They weren't waiting for humanity to build a fleet. They weren't waiting for Earth to achieve some technological threshold. They were waiting for someone to answer. The question that kept her awake wasn't whether to use the channel. It was what to say. Because whatever was said first, whatever human voice crossed that threshold, would be the first data point in whatever judgment the Varrock had already begun to form. And if her analysis of their transmission patterns was correct, the flagship, the first voice, the Queen's ship, had its own system for recognizing the quality of what it received. Not just the content. The voice itself. Vasquez had spent 3 years studying xenolinguistics on the quiet assumption she'd never needed. She had spent the last 6 weeks wondering if the universe had been building toward precisely this moment, in precisely this room, for longer than she had been alive. She pressed record. The Varrock didn't build their communication architecture the way humanity built its networks. That was the first genuinely useful piece of intelligence Study Group 11 produced, and it took 4 months of signal analysis to arrive at it. Human communication infrastructure was built on redundancy. Multiple pathways, distributed nodes, fail-safe systems designed to reroute around damage. It was an engineering philosophy shaped by war, by the knowledge that infrastructure would be targeted. The Varrock used a single primary channel per fleet. One frequency. One direction. One voice at the top of whatever hierarchy governed their operations, speaking outward through a dedicated carrier wave that nothing else used and nothing else could mimic. They called it, in the rough translation Study Group 11 developed over 4 months, the resonance of authority. The first voice channel. And the flagship of every Varrock fleet carried the master transmitter for its particular resonance signature. A signature so precisely calibrated that even the smallest deviation in frequency or modulation would register as inauthentic. This was not a vulnerability exactly. It was a design philosophy that reflected something deep about how Varrock civilization was organized. Authority was singular, recognizable, and non-transferable. A Varrock commander who could not transmit on the first voice frequency was, by the logic of their own culture, not a commander at all. Which meant the flagship, the Queen's ship as the media had taken to calling it, borrowing from the early imagery of its architecture, which resembled nothing so much as an enormous curved crown against the black, was not just the largest ship in the fleet. It was the fleet's nervous system. And for 52 years, its equivalent frequency had been left open, tuned to the same carrier wave as humanity's 1974 Arecibo transmission, broadcasting in a pattern that, once you understood the Varrock communication architecture, was unmistakably an invitation. They left a door open, Vasquez explained to the Joint Chiefs during her second briefing, the one that was actually listened to. Not a door into their ship. A door into their protocol. If someone on our end broadcasts on that frequency with sufficient fidelity, with the right modulation characteristics, the right structural patterns in the transmission, the flagship will register it as a legitimate contact event. The general sitting at the end of the table, a man named Okoro who had commanded Earth's asteroid belt defense network for 12 years, leaned forward. What does register as legitimate mean in practical terms? It means the flagship systems, and by extension its commander, will treat the transmission as coming from a recognized authority. Not a superior authority, but an acknowledged one. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room full of experienced military strategists simultaneously reaches the same conclusion and needs a moment to verify that they've reached it correctly. "You're saying," Okoro said slowly, "that if we can broadcast on their first voice frequency with sufficient technical precision, the flagship will hear it as a message from someone worth listening to." "More than that," Vasquez said. "The flagship's recognition system is partly automated. If the transmission meets the fidelity threshold, certain response protocols activate regardless of what the commanding officer decides. The fleet doesn't just hear us. Parts of the fleet respond to us, on a procedural level, before any Varric individual makes a conscious decision." "How confident are you in this analysis?" 73%, she said, which in the world of xenolinguistic first contact analysis was extraordinarily high. "The Varric have been transmitting on this frequency for over 50 years. We have an enormous sample set. The pattern is consistent. The invitation architecture is deliberate." What she didn't say, because she had learned which rooms tolerated uncertainty and which rooms required confidence, was that the remaining 27% represented a range of outcomes she hadn't been able to fully model. The Varric recognition system might work exactly as she believed. Or it might be more sophisticated, capable of distinguishing not just frequency fidelity, but linguistic and cognitive complexity in the transmission content. In that case, getting the frequency right was only the beginning. The what you said would matter as much as how you said it. The technical team assigned to replicate the transmission frequency had 9 weeks to build a system capable of broadcasting on the first voice carrier wave with sufficient precision. The engineering challenge was substantial. The Varric frequency used a modulation system that had no direct equivalent in human communications technology. It operated across a bandwidth range that required custom transmitter hardware, and the phase coherence requirements were finer than anything currently in Earth's deep space relay network. They did it in 6 weeks. The remaining 3 were spent on calibration, and on the question of who. Because the Varric first voice protocol, as best as Study Group 11 could determine, was not simply a matter of technical transmission quality. The carrier wave's modulation characteristics included components that varied with the biological voice patterns of the transmitter. Not arbitrary variation, structured variation, encoding something about the physiological state, the cognitive pattern, the attention of the person speaking. In simple terms, the Varric flagship would know if the voice it received was calm or panicked, focused or scattered, authoritative or uncertain. This was the piece of information that had kept Vasquez awake for 6 weeks. The channel didn't just require the right frequency. It required the right person. And the recognition wasn't purely mechanical. The Varric had, embedded in their first voice protocol, something that functioned like a vocal authentication layer, not biometric in the human sense but cognitive. The flagship systems would assess the transmission for characteristics that, in Varric culture, marked a speaker as someone worth engaging with. Clarity of intent. Absence of deception markers. What the rough translation rendered as structural honesty, a quality in the way information was organized and delivered that signaled whether the speaker understood what they were saying, believed it, and was not attempting to hide something in the structure of the message itself. The Varric, it appeared, had developed the ability to detect bullshit at the frequency level. This created an immediate and significant problem. Earth's government wanted to send a politician. Or failing that, a diplomat. Someone trained in the careful navigation of statements, the precise calibration of language to achieve desired interpretations, the management of truth for strategic effect. Vasquez argued, with considerable force and at some professional risk, that sending such a person would be counterproductive at best and catastrophic at worst. Their system will flag deception architecture in the transmission, she told the Oversight Committee. Not necessarily because the speaker is lying. Because diplomats are trained to structure speech in ways that, to a Varric recognition system, will read as concealment. We need someone who speaks directly. Who means exactly what they say. Who is not managing an agenda beyond the words themselves. You're describing someone who doesn't exist in this building, the committee chair said. I'm describing a scientist, Vasquez said. Or a soldier. Someone whose training is about accuracy, not persuasion. The irony that was not lost on her, and which she did not share with the committee, was that the person who best fit the profile she was describing was herself. She had spent 3 years in deep space patrol, where communication had to be precise because the consequences of ambiguity were measured in lives. She had spent 8 years in xenolinguistics, where the entire discipline was built on meaning what you said and saying what you meant. She understood the Varric transmission architecture better than anyone alive. And she was, by every measure she could apply objectively, the wrong choice for this assignment. She was not a head of state. She was not a senior military commander. She had no formal diplomatic standing. She was a commander in a study group that didn't officially exist, which meant that if the Varrock First Voice Protocol registered the authority level of the speaker along with their cognitive characteristics, she would transmit as precisely what she was: a mid-level analyst with significant expertise and no institutional power. Whether that would be sufficient, whether the Varrock valued expertise over rank, or recognized that the person most qualified to speak was not necessarily the person with the most titles, was the 27% she couldn't resolve. She decided in the end that the question was moot. There was nobody else. The fleet was 3 weeks out from the inner solar system when the technical team declared the transmission system ready. Earth's combined defense network was in position, not to fight, not in any realistic sense, but to exist visibly, to demonstrate that humanity had resources and organization and would not simply absorb whatever came next without response. The political leadership had approved Vasquez's approach, after considerable debate, with a caveat: she would have one transmission. If the flagship did not respond favorably, the channel would be handed to a formal diplomatic team, and whatever advantage her analysis had identified would be pursued through conventional means. One chance. She sat in front of the transmitter for 40 minutes before she pressed record. She had written 12 drafts of what she was going to say. She had thrown all 12 away. In the end, she said what she had always believed was the only honest thing to say at the beginning of any significant conversation. Exactly what she knew, exactly what she didn't know, and exactly what she hoped. The transmission lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. It traveled outward at light speed toward a flagship that was already close enough that the delay would be less than 3 minutes each way. The response came in 6. The 6-minute gap between Vasquez's transmission and the flagship's response was the longest 6 minutes in recorded human history. That's not sentiment. The monitoring stations across Earth's inner system were recording at full capacity. The combined defense fleet, positioned in a loose arc between Mars and the asteroid belt, was running complete sensor sweeps every 90 seconds. 14 governments had representatives in secure communication links with the Oversight Committee. The entire apparatus of human civilization, in those 6 minutes, was pointed at one frequency and waiting. What most people don't understand about that moment, what the retrospective documentaries and anniversary broadcasts consistently get wrong, is that the silence itself was data. Lieutenant Commander Priya Shenoy, the sensor analysis lead at Meridian Station, had been tracking the Varrock fleet's internal communication patterns since the vessels entered the inner solar system. The fleet communicated constantly, not on the first voice channel, which remained the exclusive domain of flagship to outside transmissions, but on a dense web of tactical frequencies that Shenoy's team had been mapping for weeks. In the 6 minutes between Vasquez's transmission and the flagship's response, every one of those internal channels went quiet. 40-plus vessels, hundreds of internal communication links, and then nothing. Not a reduction in traffic. Not a shift in frequency. A complete cessation, beginning approximately 90 seconds after Vasquez's transmission would have reached the flagship. They stopped talking to each other, Shenoy reported to Vasquez's team, her voice carrying the particular flat quality of someone delivering information they find astonishing but are determined to present professionally. All 43 vessels. Simultaneously. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The implication required very little analysis. Whatever Vasquez had said, whatever the first voice protocol had registered in her transmission, it had caused the Varrock fleet to stop what it was doing and pay attention. The flagship's response, when it came, was 7.3 seconds long. The translation took 11 hours. Not because the message was complex. Because it was so compressed, so layered with embedded meaning in the Varrock communication structure, that Study Group 11's translation team needed that long to be confident they hadn't missed something. In any Varrock first voice exchange, what appeared on the surface was rarely the whole message. The modulation characteristics, the frequency shifts, the structural patterns, all of it carried additional information that a native speaker would parse automatically and a human analyst had to decompose deliberately. The surface content of the flagship's response, stripped of all subtext, was approximately 40 words in English equivalent. Acknowledge. The voice carries weight. Proceed on this channel. We will hold position at current coordinates until exchange is complete. The subtext was considerably more significant. The phrase translated as the voice carries weight was, in Varrock communication protocol, a formal recognition statement, equivalent to a flag officer acknowledging a subordinate's report as credible and worth acting upon. It was not an expression of equality. It was not a greeting between peers. But it was something the Varrock First Voice Protocol reserved exclusively for transmissions that had passed the cognitive authentication layer. In practical terms, the flagship had heard Vasquez, assessed her transmission against whatever criteria its systems used, and determined she was a legitimate contact event. What does hold position mean for a fleet this size? General Okoro asked during the immediate briefing. Shinoy answered because the question was hers. They've decelerated. All 43 vessels. The flagship and its immediate escort, 6 ships, are at approximately 1.4 million kilometers. The remaining vessels have pulled back to roughly 4 million. They've spread out, which actually reduces their tactical concentration. They're not in an attack formation. Okoro looked at Vasquez. Is that intentional communication? Almost certainly, she said. The fleet disposition is part of the message. They're telling us they're waiting. And they're demonstrating, in the most physically unambiguous way possible, that they're not preparing an immediate action. What she didn't say, because the briefing had 17 people in it and she was still processing the full translation analysis, was what the deepest layer of the flagship's response had contained. The modulation characteristics of the response, the layer beneath the surface content, beneath even the formal recognition statement, included a structural pattern that Study Group 11's translation team had seen only twice before in the archive of Varrock transmissions. Both previous instances had been in exchanges between what the team believed were Varrock fleet commanders and civilian governmental authorities. It was a waiting posture signal. Specifically, a signal that indicated the flagship's commander had placed the fleet in a state of suspension pending further communication, and that this decision had been made on the commander's personal authority, overriding whatever standing orders governed the fleet's original mission parameters. The Varrock fleet commander had, on the basis of a 4-minute transmission from a human analyst who didn't officially exist, decided unilaterally to pause the fleet's mission. That fact had 2 possible interpretations. The optimistic interpretation: Vasquez's analysis was correct, her transmission had worked exactly as intended, and the Varrock were genuinely interested in dialogue. The less optimistic interpretation: the fleet commander had paused not because she was impressed, but because she was uncertain, because the transmission had introduced a variable she hadn't anticipated, and she needed time to assess it before proceeding. And a fleet commander who needed time to assess an unexpected variable was not necessarily a fleet commander who was reconsidering her mission. She might simply be one who preferred to understand a situation fully before acting on it. Vasquez spent 40 minutes with the translation team going over the modulation analysis before she concluded, tentatively, that the evidence slightly favored the optimistic interpretation. The specific frequency characteristics of the waiting posture signal carried emotional valence markers, components that, in the Varrock communication system, encoded something about the internal state of the speaker. And the markers in the flagship's response clustered around what the team's best current model identified as focused attention rather than strategic recalibration. The commander wasn't reassessing her mission. She was interested. That distinction was everything, and it was also still only Vasquez's interpretation of a communication system she had been studying for less than 2 years, in a species she had never met, whose psychology she was inferring from transmitted data and mathematical structure. She reported her assessment to the Oversight Committee with full uncertainty bounds and a recommendation: respond on the first voice channel within the hour, while the fleet remained stationary, before the waiting posture signal had time to decay into something less favorable. The committee debated for 40 minutes. Vasquez waited outside the briefing room and thought about what she would say next. The first transmission had been about establishing contact, demonstrating that the voice on Earth's end could operate within the first voice protocol, could transmit with sufficient fidelity and cognitive authenticity to pass the flagship's recognition threshold. She had succeeded at that, apparently. But the recognition threshold was only the first gate. The Varrock First Voice Protocol, she believed, was structured in layers. The first layer was authentication. Can this voice participate in legitimate exchange? The second layer, which the fleet's silent attention during the 6-minute gap suggested was already active, was assessment. What is the quality of what this voice has to say? The third layer, and this was where her analysis became significantly more speculative, was negotiation of terms, the establishment of what kind of exchange this would be and under what framework. To reach the third layer, the second transmission had to demonstrate something specific: that the human speaking had a clear and accurate understanding of the situation. Not a favorable understanding. Not a reassuring one. An accurate one. The Varrock structural honesty assessment, she believed, would flag any attempt to present the situation as simpler or more comfortable than it actually was. The second transmission couldn't be diplomatic. It couldn't manage the narrative. It had to describe as precisely as possible what Earth actually was. What it had, what it lacked, what it knew, and what it didn't. Including the parts that were frightening to say out loud. Including the acknowledgement that humanity had seen the fleet's size and run the numbers and understood, with clear-eyed realism, that a direct military confrontation would not favor Earth. That wasn't weakness to admit. Or rather, whether it was weakness depended entirely on the Varek's values. If they respected submission, admitting it was surrender. If they respected honesty, admitting it was the most powerful thing humanity could say. Vasquez had spent 2 years studying the Varek transmission archive. She had a strong opinion about which one it was. She would have to be right. The committee door opened. The committee chair looked at her for a moment before speaking. His expression was the careful neutral of someone who has just made a decision they're not certain about and has committed to it anyway. "You have the channel," he said. "But we need a time limit. 48 hours. After that, we bring in the formal diplomatic team regardless of where the exchange stands. 48 hours to navigate the most consequential conversation in human history." Vasquez nodded once. She went back to her desk and started writing. Vasquez's second transmission was 11 minutes long. She had wanted to keep it shorter. Every training instinct she had, every principle of strategic communication she had absorbed in 8 years of xenolinguistics, argued for brevity, for saying the essential things clearly and stopping before you said anything that could be misinterpreted. The Varek first voice protocol favored precision over volume. But precision, she had come to understand, sometimes required length. Because the thing she needed to say accurately, the thing she believed the structural honesty assessment would penalize her for omitting, was a complete picture. Not a curated one. She described Earth's situation without softening it. She described the fleet humanity had assembled, its actual numbers, its actual capabilities, its actual purpose, which was not to fight but to be visibly present. She described the gap between that fleet and the Varek force currently parked at 1.4 million kilometers, and she described it in the specific language of military analysis rather than diplomatic euphemism. "We are significantly outmassed, we know this, and we are not pretending otherwise." She described what humanity wanted from this exchange. Not capitulation, not alliance, not the specific terms of any agreement, but the more fundamental thing that had to precede all of that, an understanding of the Varek's purpose in coming here, and an opportunity to respond to it as equals in a conversation rather than as a subject population receiving instructions. She described what she did not know, which was everything important. The Varek commander's intentions, the nature of the mission, the framework within which any exchange would be evaluated, the criteria for whatever judgment the fleet had come to render. And then she said the thing she had decided was necessary even though it was the most professionally exposed position she had ever taken in any communication. She said, "I am not the person my civilization would have chosen to speak to you. I have no formal political authority. I have no military command. What I have is the best current understanding of your communication architecture and a judgment that the person best equipped to participate in this protocol authentically may not be the person my government would otherwise select. If that assessment is itself an error, if your recognition system evaluates authority rather than understanding, then this exchange should be redirected to someone with greater institutional standing, and I will accept that outcome." She pressed send. The wait this time was longer than 6 minutes. Chenoy's team, watching the fleet's internal communication patterns, reported that the tactical channels went quiet again, but this time not all at once. The silence spread gradually, vessel by vessel, over approximately 40 seconds, as if news was traveling through the fleet and each ship fell quiet as it received it. The flagship's response came 22 minutes after Vasquez's transmission reached it. It was 41 seconds long. The translation, even compressed to surface content, took 6 hours because the team couldn't agree on a single phrase in the third sentence, and the disagreement about that phrase was significant enough to potentially change the entire meaning of the message. The surface content of the first 2 sentences was clear. "Your understanding of this channel is accurate. The assessment that generated your uncertainty about authority is itself the kind of assessment this channel recognizes." Translation team consensus. The flagship was acknowledging, directly, that the first voice protocol weighted understanding and honesty over formal rank. Vasquez's self-assessment, including the disclosure of her limited authority, had not weakened her position in the exchange. It had confirmed it. The third sentence was where the team had disagreed. The phrase in question was a compound construction in the Varek communication system that had no direct English equivalent. The 2 interpretive camps had been calling it either evaluation complete or evaluation ongoing, and the difference between those two translations was the difference between the Varrock commander having already formed her judgment and the Varrock commander still being in the process of forming it. Vasquez read both translations. Then she read the modulation analysis of the third sentence. Then she looked at the emotional valence markers around the compound phrase for 40 minutes. Her conclusion, which she shared with the translation team and which eventually achieved consensus, was that the phrase was deliberately ambiguous. Not ambiguous because the Varrock lacked precision. Everything else in their communication architecture suggested they were extremely precise. Deliberately ambiguous because the ambiguity itself was information. The commander was saying, in effect, you are still being assessed and I am telling you that openly, and my telling you that openly is itself part of the assessment. It was a recursive test. Everything was still on the table. And the most honest response to that fact was to know it, acknowledge it, and continue. The fourth and fifth sentences of the message resolved the translation team's debate about the third by providing context that made the interpretation clear. The voice from your world has passed the recognition threshold. What it has not yet established is the nature of the authority it represents. Not institutional authority, which your channel has correctly identified as secondary, but the authority of accurate representation. Does your voice speak truly for what your civilization is? The question landed in the briefing room with the weight of something that had been building toward it for a very long time. Does your voice speak truly for what your civilization is? Not, do you have the power to make agreements? Not, are you authorized to negotiate? But something deeper and more difficult. Are you an accurate representative? Does what you say about humanity reflect what humanity actually is? General Okoro, reading the translation over Vasquez's shoulder, said nothing for almost a minute. That's an impossible question, he finally said. No single person can speak truly for 8 billion people. No, Vasquez agreed. But the question isn't whether I can represent every human. The question is whether what I say about humanity is accurate. She paused. And whether I'm honest about the things that aren't represented in what I say. She drafted the response herself, without committee review, and sent it before the 48-hour window became a political problem. The core of it was this. No single voice can speak truly for a civilization of 8 billion people who have spent most of their history in disagreement with each other. What I can offer is accuracy about the distribution of what humanity is, the range of what we want, what we fear, what we're capable of, and what we've done. I can represent the honest uncertainty of a species that hasn't reached consensus on most of the important questions, and that is itself part of what we are. Then she added something she had been thinking about for 3 days and that she was not certain was strategically wise but that she believed was required by the terms of the exchange. Your fleet is significantly larger than anything my civilization can match. I have told you this already. What I have not told you, and what accurate representation requires me to say, is that this asymmetry does not mean humanity has already calculated surrender. We have not. Not because we believe the military calculation favors us. It does not. But because the calculation humanity runs in situations like this is not only military. We have a history longer than our spaceflight, of finding solutions to problems that initially appeared to offer only losing options. I'm not telling you we will win a conflict. I am telling you that a civilization that has been solving impossible problems for 10,000 years does not read an asymmetrical situation as automatically resolved. She read it twice. Then she sent it. The fleet's internal channels, Shenoy reported, went quiet within 30 seconds of the transmission reaching the flagship. They stayed quiet for 19 minutes. When the flagship responded, the message was 3 sentences. The translation was immediate and unanimous. That is the most accurate thing a voice from your world has said in this exchange. We will speak further. Hold your position. And then a 4th sentence that the translation team sat with for 2 hours before they brought it to Vasquez, because they weren't sure how to contextualize it. The commander of the first voice would hear this channel directly. Respond when ready. The Varrock fleet commander wanted to speak to Vasquez personally. Not through the first voice protocol's automated authentication layer. Not through the transmission architecture that filtered and analyzed incoming signals. Directly. Vasquez looked at the translation for a long time. Then she looked at Shenoy. What is the fleet doing right now? Shenoy checked her display. Same disposition as before. No change in formation. No power signatures consistent with weapons systems activation. The 6 escort vessels around the flagship have actually increased their distance from the flagship slightly. She hesitated. It looks like they're giving it room. Vasquez nodded slowly. She had 42 minutes left in her 48-hour window. She began preparing the response. The decision to hold position, made by the Varrock fleet commander and communicated through the first voice protocol, should have been straightforward to analyze from a military standpoint. 43 vessels. Stationary. Weapons systems in passive configuration. Fleet disposed in a pattern that any competent tactical analyst would recognize as non-threatening. The math of it looked clear. The Varrock had chosen to wait. What made it complicated was what waiting meant for a fleet of that size. Lieutenant General Adise Morrow had commanded Earth's combined deep space defense force for 6 years. She had 3 decades of experience in strategic military analysis. She had written the doctrine that governed Earth's current fleet disposition, and she had been one of the senior commanders who had looked at the initial Varrock fleet imagery and run the tonnage comparison without flinching. She was not, by any standard, someone who was easily unsettled. She was unsettled now. "Walk me through it again," she said to her tactical intelligence team. From the moment the transmission reached the flagship, Captain Elon Moritz had been running continuous sensor analysis on the Varrock fleet for 96 hours. He had the specific quality of exhaustion that comes from sustained precision work, not the foggy kind but the sharpened kind, where the mind narrows to the task so completely that everything outside it becomes temporary and irrelevant. He pulled up the timeline display. Transmission arrives at the flagship at 14 hours 32 minutes and 7 seconds station time. At 14 hours 33 minutes and 42 seconds, 95 seconds later, the first internal Varrock communication channels go dark. Not all of them simultaneously. The flagship first. Then the 6 escort vessels in under 3 seconds. Then the silence spreads outward through the remaining 37 vessels over approximately 40 seconds. Morrow watched the timeline progression. Interpretation. The flagship received something it considered significant enough to communicate to its immediate escort in real time. The 40-second spread to the rest of the fleet is consistent with a command signal propagating through the fleet's tactical network at standard speed. But the content of what propagated, whatever caused 37 vessels to cease internal communications simultaneously, wasn't available to them until the flagship transmitted it. So the flagship made a decision, transmitted that decision to the escort, and then that decision went fleet-wide. Yes. The decision being, stop all non-essential internal communication and pay attention to what's happening on the first voice channel. Morrow was quiet for a moment. That's a command decision. That's not an automated system response. Correct. The fleet's automated recognition systems would have flagged the incoming transmission and passed it to the commander. What happened after that was a choice. The commander chose to make it a fleet-wide event. This was the piece that kept pulling Morrow's attention. Because a fleet commander who transmits a command to 40-plus vessels to stop talking and listen is a commander who has assessed something as significant, not just worth noting personally, but worth the attention of the entire military force under her command. And that assessment had been made within 95 seconds of receiving Vasquez's transmission. What can we infer about the commander from that timing? Morrow asked. Moritz hesitated. He was a tactical analyst, not a psychologist or a xenolinguist, and he was careful about the boundaries of his expertise. The 95-second window is fast. It suggests the commander either had clear criteria for what constituted a significant incoming transmission, criteria that Vasquez's signal met quickly and decisively, or she made a rapid personal judgment call. Or both. Or both. The second thing that had unsettled Morrow was the disposition change. When the Varrock fleet initially held position, the 43 vessels were distributed in a pattern that Morrow's team had analyzed as a standard fleet posture for an approach under uncertain conditions. Not an attack formation, but one that preserved options, keeping vessels in configurations that could transition to offensive or defensive alignment without significant repositioning. After Vasquez's second transmission, the one in which she had described the military asymmetry plainly and then described humanity's historical relationship with impossible problems, the fleet's disposition had shifted. Subtly. Not dramatically, but measurably. The 6 escort vessels around the flagship had increased their distance. The outer perimeter vessels had pulled back slightly and redistributed to create more space between units. The fleet had, in tactical terms, opened up, reduced its concentration, increased the physical separation between vessels. In human military doctrine, Morrow had said during the initial briefing on this change, a fleet opening up like that means one of two things. Either they're preparing to disperse for an engagement, spreading out to reduce the effectiveness of area effect weapons, or they're demonstrating non-aggression. Reducing concentration as a visual and tactical signal that you're not about to do something. The absence of any other indicators consistent with engagement preparation. No power spikes in propulsion, no energy signatures from weapon systems, No sensor sweeps of the type you'd conduct if you were mapping targets, pointed strongly toward the second interpretation. The fleet had physically opened up as a gesture. They understood, Vasquez had said when Morrow showed her the disposition analysis, that we were watching their formation the same way they were watching our channel. They knew we'd interpret a tighter formation as more threatening. So they loosened it. That means they've been managing how they appear to us. They've been managing how they appear to us the entire time. The initial fleet disposition when they entered the inner system, the one that looked non-threatening, that was also deliberate. They didn't arrive in a combat formation. Morrow had sat with that for a while. Either they don't need to, they're confident enough in their capability that they don't feel the need to project it through formation, or the entire approach has been calibrated to produce specific interpretations on our end. Probably both, Vasquez had said. And the fact that both things can be true simultaneously is important. A fleet confident enough in its capability to not need a threatening formation is also a fleet that understands the value of not being threatening when they have a choice. What Morrow kept returning to in the hours since the Varric commander had requested direct communication with Vasquez was a question that didn't have a clear military answer. What does it mean that the fleet hasn't moved? On one level it was simple. The commander had said hold position and the fleet was holding position. Command and control functioning as designed. But 43 vessels, representing an enormous investment in resources and technology and personnel, had been stationary for more than 30 hours. Whatever the Varric fleet's original mission parameters had been, and Earth still didn't know what those parameters were, the commander had suspended them pending this exchange. For over a day. That was a significant commitment. Morrow pulled up the timeline of the communication exchange and looked at it from a purely military perspective. Strip out the xenolinguistics, the translation analysis, the speculation about Varric culture and values. Look at the actions. A fleet of 43 vessels arrives in the inner solar system. They establish contact through a protocol that requires the other party to demonstrate understanding and authenticity. When that demonstration is made, the fleet holds position. When the authenticity is confirmed through a second exchange, the fleet commander requests direct communication. At no point does the fleet take any action that reduces Earth's options. At no point does it create a fait accompli, a physical situation that humanity would have to respond to with force or accept as a given. Every action has been reversible. Every position has been one the fleet can hold or leave without committing to an outcome. They're not cornering us, Morrow said to Moritz. No, he agreed. They're leaving us room. Why? Moritz looked at his display for a moment. If I were them, if I were a commander with significantly superior capability, arriving at a first contact scenario, and I didn't corner them, the reason would be either that I wasn't certain I wanted the outcome that cornering them would produce, or that I valued what might come from leaving them room more than I valued the control that cornering them would give me. Or I was playing a longer game, Morrow said. Letting them feel like they have room so that when I do close it, the psychological effect is greater. Yes, that's also possible. It was always possible. Military analysis, in the absence of clear intelligence about intentions, had to hold all the possible interpretations simultaneously. Morrow had been doing that for 3 decades. She was comfortable with uncertainty. What she was less comfortable with was the timeline. Vasquez had 20 minutes left in her 48-hour window. The formal diplomatic team was staged and ready. If Vasquez didn't produce something actionable in those 20 minutes, some basis for continuing the exchange, some framework that the committee could point to as progress, the channel would change hands, the diplomatic team would take over, and whatever had been built in the past 48 hours would be handed to people who hadn't been part of building it. Morrow was not a diplomat. She was not a xenolinguist. But she had spent 30 years studying the relationship between communication and conflict, and she had a strong, unprovable intuition that handing this exchange to a diplomatic team right now would be a mistake of a particular kind. The kind that looks responsible and is actually a way of feeling safe while taking a risk. The Varric commander had requested to speak directly with Vasquez. Not with Earth's government. Not with a formal diplomatic representative. With a specific voice that had passed the first voice protocol's recognition threshold. Changing that voice now, with the direct communication request pending, would be sending a message. And Morrow was not confident it would be the right one. She picked up the secure line to the Oversight Committee. I need to make a recommendation, she said, about the 48-hour window. The Oversight Committee extended the window. Not without debate. Not without the formal diplomatic team registering formal objections that were entered into the record and would later become the subject of considerable academic and political analysis. But General Moro's recommendation carried weight that abstract objections couldn't easily overcome, and the committee voted 7-4 to extend Vasquez's authority over the first voice channel for an additional 72 hours. The vote was logged at 3:47 station time. Vasquez was already composing her response to the direct communication request. The challenge of that response was different from everything that had come before. The first two transmissions had been about establishing the exchange, demonstrating authenticity, describing Earth's situation accurately, building enough foundation in the first voice protocol for the communication to continue. They had been, in a meaningful sense, applications to be considered. This transmission was a reply to an invitation. The Varrock commander wanted to speak directly. What Vasquez needed to determine, and the translation team had been working on this for hours without producing consensus, was what directly meant in Varrock communication terms. The word used in the fourth sentence of the flagship's last transmission was a compound that the team had been rendering as directly for lack of a better option, but the underlying structure suggested something more specific. It wasn't simply without intermediary. It had a quality that the most linguistically experienced member of the team, Dr. Amara Diallo, described as voice-to-voice in the sense of person-to-person, a communication modality that, in the Varrock system, implied a reduction of the formal protocol architecture. Less filtered. More exposed. The automated recognition and authentication systems, Diallo explained to Vasquez, are still active, they're always active on the first voice channel. But the request for direct communication suggests the commander wants to reduce the structured distance between speakers. In human terms, it's the difference between a formal written exchange and a conversation. What are the risks? In a conversation, there's less time to think before responding. Less opportunity to review what you're transmitting. The authentication layer will still be reading everything, possibly more closely because the reduced structure makes the cognitive and emotional signals cleaner and easier to analyze. Diallo paused. If the structural honesty assessment is continuous as we believe it is, then direct communication gives it better data. Better in both directions. If you're being honest, it confirms that more clearly. If you're managing something, it's more likely to detect it. Vasquez understood what that meant in practical terms. Direct communication with the Varrock commander was not a reward for having passed the initial assessment. It was a deeper level of the same assessment. The protocol was tightening, not relaxing. She spent 40 minutes with the translation team going over every piece of the archived Varrock transmissions that featured direct communication exchanges between Varrock speakers. They weren't numerous. The first voice protocol was formal by design, and direct communication requests appeared to be reserved for situations of significant consequence. But the patterns in those exchanges were instructive. Direct communication in the Varrock system, based on the analysis, was characterized by three things: shorter transmission units, higher information density per unit, and a quality that Diallo had started calling reciprocal exposure, both parties revealing uncertainty, not just certainty. The formal protocol favored clear statements. Direct communication apparently could accommodate questions. They ask each other things, Vasquez said, reading through the examples. Yes. Not rhetorical questions. Actual requests for information the speaker doesn't have. That's surprisingly vulnerable. It may not be vulnerability in their framework, Diallo said carefully. Admitting you don't know something in the context of the structural honesty assessment might be strength. It's more honest than pretending you know. Vasquez looked at the response she had been drafting. She deleted 2 paragraphs that she now recognized as answers to questions the commander hadn't asked yet, preemptive explanations that she had included because she was uncertain and wanted to get ahead of potential misunderstandings. That was management. That was exactly the kind of structural hedging the structural honesty assessment was presumably designed to detect and penalize. She wrote something shorter instead. The response she sent was the briefest transmission in the exchange so far, barely 2 minutes. It acknowledged the request for direct communication, confirmed her readiness to proceed, and then, because Diallo's analysis of the direct communication examples had suggested this was the appropriate posture, asked a question. In this channel, I have described what I know and what I don't know about your civilization and your purpose here. I have represented my own limitations honestly as I understand them. To proceed in direct communication with accuracy, I need to understand what you are assessing us for. Not what you will do depending on the outcome, that is your decision to make. But what the criteria of the assessment are. What does a civilization need to be, or demonstrate, to receive a favorable conclusion from your fleet? She sent it. Shenoy, watching the fleet's internal communication patterns, reported that the channels didn't go quiet this time. There was a brief reduction in traffic, 5-6 seconds, and then activity resumed at normal levels. The response came in 4 minutes. It was the longest transmission the flagship had sent. 53 seconds. And when the translation team finished with it, faster this time because the direct communication register was cleaner and more parsable, it changed the nature of everything that had come before. The flagship's message in full translation was, "This fleet does not make conquest decisions. That is not what this kind of fleet does. We assess whether a civilization has reached the threshold at which contact produces net benefit rather than net harm, to both parties. The threshold is not technological. It is not military. It is cognitive and behavioral. Is this civilization capable of receiving contact without destroying itself or others in the process? The history of contact events suggests that civilizations below this threshold are harmed more than helped by encounters with civilizations above it. We are not the arbiters of your worth. We are the arbiters of your readiness. Your last 3 transmissions have been the subject of considerable discussion aboard this fleet. The discussion is not yet complete. But I will tell you what I can. No transmission from your world has contained a deliberate attempt to deceive this channel. That is less common than you might expect." Vasquez read the translation 3 times. Then she sat very still for almost a minute. The fleet wasn't here to conquer. It was here to assess readiness. And the criterion for readiness, the thing that determined whether first contact would help or hurt humanity, wasn't military capability or technological development. It was honesty. The capacity to engage with reality as it was, rather than as you needed it to be. She thought about the 12 drafts she had thrown away. The carefully managed statements she had chosen not to send. The deliberate exposures she had made instead. The admission of limited authority, the acknowledgement of military asymmetry, the honest description of not knowing enough. She thought about the 27% she had never been able to resolve. And she understood, with a clarity that felt like something settling into place rather than something discovered, that the 27% had never been a problem to solve. It had been the right answer to a question she hadn't known how to ask. The uncertainty she had carried into every transmission, the genuine, functional uncertainty of someone who didn't know enough and knew they didn't know enough, had been the most important thing she transmitted. Because a civilization capable of genuine uncertainty, and capable of transmitting it honestly without trying to hide it, was a civilization that could be reached, that could update, that could respond to new information without the new information first having to fight through a wall of managed narrative. She had 49 hours left in the extended window. She used the next 6 to prepare what she would say next, not a transmission but a framework. A structure for the conversation that was coming, now that both parties understood what the conversation was actually about. Morrow came to find her at hour 4. "The committee wants a briefing," she said. "Full translation analysis, tactical assessment, projection for the next 48 hours. "I'll give them one," Vasquez said. "But I need them to understand something first." "What?" Vasquez looked up from the document she was building. "The fleet is not going to attack. Not because we've deterred them and not because they've decided we're allies. Because the thing they came here to find out, whether we're capable of honest engagement, is a question that attacking us would not answer. An attack would end the assessment, not complete it. And they want to complete it." Morrow was quiet for a moment. "How confident are you? In the analysis?" 86%. "Higher than before." "Yes." Vasquez set down her stylus. "Because she told me what the criteria were. And the criteria explain everything that happened before she told me. Once you know what you're looking for, the data makes more sense." Morrow nodded slowly. "And the remaining 14%? Is the part where I'm wrong about the Varric commander's ability to override her own fleet's standing orders indefinitely." She paused the mission on personal authority. She can presumably unpause it the same way. If something in the next 48 hours reads as a fundamental failure of the honesty threshold, she might conclude the assessment is complete and the conclusion is unfavorable. What would cause that? If someone above my pay grade decides this is going well and sends in a political team to manage the narrative, Vasquez said, without particular inflection. Morrow looked at her for a long moment. "I'll handle the committee briefing myself," she said. The direct communication session between Vasquez and the Varric fleet commander lasted 11 hours and 43 minutes across 2 days. There was no live audio. The first voice protocol operated through transmitted signals, not real-time voice exchange. The distances involved, even at the compressed range of 1.4 million kilometers, produced a several-second delay that made genuine conversation impossible in the human sense. What the session consisted of was an extended, rapid rhythm exchange of transmissions. Vasquez sending, the commander responding, the interval between exchanges measured in minutes rather than the hours that had characterized the early communication. Moritz's team tracked the fleet's internal communications throughout. What they observed over the 11 hours was unlike anything in the preceding days. The Varrock fleet's internal channels, which had alternated between silence and normal activity during the earlier exchanges, settled into a sustained moderate activity pattern within the first 2 hours of the direct session. Not the silence of attention or the density of active operations. Something steadier, more consistent. Moritz, after conferring with Diallo's translation team, eventually characterized it as background operational monitoring, the fleet running normal maintenance and status functions, with no elevated alert posture, while the command-level attention was occupied elsewhere. "They're comfortable," Shenoy summarized it. "The fleet has settled. They're not watching us the same way they were." What that meant tactically was a reduction in the specific heightened awareness that had characterized the fleet's posture during the initial exchanges, the posture of an organization in a high-stakes evaluation, scanning for threats. The sustained moderate activity suggested the evaluation had moved into a different phase. Still active but less acute. Less defended. Morrow noted it in her operational log but did not share the observation with the Oversight Committee. The committee was already managing the political pressure that came from 11 hours of a conversation that nobody outside Study Group 11 fully understood, and adding an interpretation that could be read as "the aliens have relaxed around us" felt like information that would be used in ways she couldn't control. What she could control was the disposition of Earth's defense fleet. She adjusted it 3 times during the 11 hours. Each adjustment was minor, small changes in the positioning of the outer perimeter vessels, slight shifts in the orientation of the sensor arrays. None of the changes increased Earth's defensive or offensive posture. They were the opposite. Each adjustment reduced the fleet's tactical concentration, mirrored in miniature the way the Varrock fleet had opened up in the hours after Vasquez's second transmission. Morrow had decided, without formal authorization and without telling anyone who would have formalized the decision into a committee discussion, to let the fleet's disposition speak the same language the Varrock had been using. "We're watching you. And we're showing you what watching looks like when it's not hostile." She didn't know if the Varrock commander noticed. She didn't ask. The content of the direct communication session was not fully declassified for 7 years, and even the declassified version had sections redacted on the grounds that they contained information relevant to ongoing diplomatic processes. What became known publicly, through Vasquez's own eventual account, through Diallo's academic work, and through the formal first contact documentation released by the Joint Oversight Body, was a summary of the session's major exchanges. The commander's name, rendered in the approximation that the translation team settled on, was something close to Sarathis. Whether that was her personal name, her rank designation, or some combination of the two was a question that took years of subsequent linguistic work to partly resolve. In the 11-hour session, Vasquez addressed her by the term, the first voice protocol used for the initiating speaker of a recognized transmission. Something that translated roughly as "the voice I'm speaking to," which was simultaneously impersonal and specific in the way that formal Varrock address apparently worked. Sarathis asked questions. That was the thing Vasquez would later identify as the most significant element of the session. Not what she said. What Sarathis asked. The questions were not what any human strategist would have predicted. Sarathis did not ask about Earth's military capabilities in any depth beyond what the initial exchanges had established. She did not ask about political structures, economic systems, or technological development in the way a diplomat might inventory them. She did not ask about Earth's expansion plans or its relationship to neighboring space. She asked about failure. Specifically, what were the largest failures in human history and what happened after them? She asked about disagreement, not conflict in the military sense but internal disagreement, the kind that happened between factions of the same civilization. How did humanity handle being wrong, collectively? What happened when a large number of people in a civilization believed something that turned out to be false, and then learned it was false? She asked about the relationship between honesty and cost, whether humanity had examples of situations in which telling the truth had been damaging to the person or group that told it, and how those situations had been resolved over time. And she asked, in the final exchange of the session, a question that Vasquez described in her account as the question that was always underneath all the others. How does your civilization treat the people who tell it true things it doesn't want to hear? Vasquez answered all of them, including the last one, which she answered with the specific, documented, long and uncomfortable history it deserved. The history of whistleblowers and dissidents and scientists whose accurate findings were inconvenient and who were discredited, marginalized, sometimes imprisoned, and who were sometimes, eventually vindicated. She did not present that history as a failure to be ashamed of. She presented it as what it was, a pattern that had been present across human civilization for millennia, that was still present, that was not resolved, and that coexisted with a countervailing pattern of eventual correction, a tendency across long enough timescales to return to the true thing even when it was painful. "We are not uniformly honest," she said in the transmission that answered Sarethas's final question. "We are a civilization with deep and persistent tendencies to distort information in the service of power, comfort, and narrative control. What I can say is that those tendencies are contested, that there exist within our civilization mechanisms, institutions, and individuals whose function is specifically to push back against distortion. Those mechanisms are imperfect. They fail regularly. But they exist. And the fact that this conversation is happening at all, with this voice rather than a more managed one, is itself an artifact of one of those mechanisms functioning." She sent the transmission. She waited 41 minutes for the response. When it came, it was 9 seconds long. The translation in full was, "That answer is consistent with everything your transmissions have established. We have completed the assessment. The conclusion is as follows. The civilization at this location has reached the threshold. Contact is warranted. We will remain at current position for 6 of your days to receive your formal response to this conclusion and to establish the framework for continued exchange. There is much that needs to be said. We have time." There was no celebration in the control room. Vasquez read the translation twice, then set it down on the desk in front of her and looked at the wall for several minutes. Shenoy, who had been watching the fleet sensor feeds continuously for 4 days, quietly reported that the Varric fleet's tactical channels had returned to normal operational levels. Not the silence of attention, not the elevated activity of alert posture, but the background hum of 43 vessels carrying on the business of existing in a specific location over an extended period. They were settling in. The formal response to the Varric assessment conclusion was drafted over 4 days by a team of 47 people across 8 governments, reviewed and revised 17 times, and then handed to Vasquez to transmit, on the first voice channel on the specific carrier wave frequency, in the modulation register that had become, over the preceding week, something like a common language. She read the draft once. Then she set it aside and wrote something herself. It was shorter. It was less comprehensive. It did not cover everything the 47-person team had determined needed to be said in a formal governmental response to first contact confirmation. What it said was, "We have received your conclusion and understand its significance. Humanity is not uniformly prepared for what follows. There are people among us who will be frightened, others who will see only opportunity, others who will misunderstand what has happened and act on that misunderstanding in ways that are difficult to predict. We are telling you this in advance because we have established in this exchange that accuracy about uncertainty is more valuable than the appearance of readiness. We are ready in the ways that matter and uncertain in the ways that are honest. We will be here in 6 days with the questions your conclusion raises, and with whatever we have learned in the interval about what we want from what comes next." The formal response was transmitted on a separate channel, by a separate team, with appropriate governmental authorization, 36 hours later. Sarethas did not respond to it directly. She responded to Vasquez's transmission, 6 hours after it arrived, with 3 sentences. "That is sufficient. We will speak in 6 days. Prepare your questions, not your answers." General Morrow, reading the translation in the briefing room at 5 o'clock station time, made a note in her operational log that the Varric fleet's formation had shifted again. Not a reduction in concentration this time. A reorganization, the vessels spreading into a pattern that her tactical team, after 2 hours of analysis, concluded was consistent with long-term stationary deployment rather than approach or departure posture. The fleet was configured to stay. The 6-day interval before the formal follow-on exchange was, in the public record, a period of intensive governmental preparation, the drafting of formal diplomatic frameworks, the organization of international response coordination, the beginnings of the public communication strategy that would have to be managed carefully to prevent the kind of social fracture that first contact scenarios had always threatened to produce. In the private record, the record that Vasquez kept in the log that she would not release for 15 years, it was something quieter. She spent most of it reading. Not briefing documents or diplomatic frameworks or governmental position papers. The Varric transmission archive from the beginning. 52 years of signals she now understood differently than she had a week ago, because she now knew what the signals were looking for. The archive looked different when you understood the question. The Varric had been transmitting for 52 years, encoding fragments of human communication back into their signals, maintaining a frequency tuned to the Arecibo carrier wave. She had originally interpreted this as an invitation, which it was. But it was more specific than that. Every Varric assessment of a civilization, based on what Sarah this had said during the 11-hour session, included an extended period of passive observation. The Varric didn't arrive without preparation. They watched first. They watched long enough to build a picture of what a civilization actually was, beneath what it presented. They watched the signals a civilization broadcast when it wasn't trying to communicate with anyone, the emissions of a civilization talking to itself. And then they established the first voice channel and waited to see if anyone would notice. Earth had taken 52 years to notice. That was not unusual. Sarah this had mentioned, in the context of answering one of Vasquez's questions about the assessment process, that the interval between establishing the monitoring signal and receiving a response from the observed civilization ranged from decades to centuries. Earth's 52 years was, if anything, toward the shorter end. What varied was not the time but the response. What a civilization said when it finally noticed the open channel, and whether what it said matched what 50 years of passive observation had suggested about it. Earth had said something that matched. That was the entire basis of the assessment's conclusion. A civilization that, in its unguarded signals, its science transmissions, its public debates, its recorded failures and corrections and arguments about its own nature, showed consistent evidence of the capacity for honesty under pressure. Not perfect honesty. Not honesty as a universal value uniformly applied. But honesty as a functional presence in the civilization's self-regulation system. A voice that pushed back against distortion even when distortion was convenient. And then, when the first voice channel opened and someone finally used it, the voice that came through had matched the picture the passive observation had built. Vasquez had not been selected by her government. She had been selected by the Varric assessment protocol, which had no use for the person the government would have chosen and every use for the person the protocol itself would surface. She wrote that in her private log on the 4th of the 6 days, sitting at her desk at 2 o'clock station time, with the Varric fleet visible on the long-range display as 43 steady points of light at 1.4 million kilometers. She wrote, "They didn't come to meet our leaders. They came to meet us. The distinction is significant and may take us a very long time to fully understand." On the 6th day the formal exchange session began. Vasquez transmitted first, on the first voice channel, in the register that had become the established protocol of the exchange. She had prepared questions as Sarah this had instructed. She had also, because the 11 hours of direct communication had established something that she could only describe as a working understanding, not trust exactly but the structural foundation from which trust might eventually be built, allowed herself one thing that was not a question. She said, "We are here. We are uncertain and we are paying attention and we are trying to be accurate about what we are. Whatever comes next, those things will remain true." The flagship's response came 8 minutes later. It was 2 sentences. "We know. That is why we are here."